Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really provocative argument from Tucker Carlson. It's one that completely challenges how we think about reality, about power, and about the hidden forces that just might be shaping our world. And we're jumping right in at the deep end with this pretty startling claim. You have to understand, this single sentence isn't just a soundbite. It's really the bedrock of an entire worldview that tries to connect modern politics with, well, ancient history. What's being implied here is that the fights we see on the surface, political or ideological battles, are just masking a much deeper, much older conflict.
So to really get our heads around this, here's the roadmap we're going to follow. We'll kick things off with the main thesis, then we'll look at the evidence that's presented, explore some of the historical parallels, dig into the alleged cover-up, and then wrap up with the argument's final, pretty surprising conclusion.
Okay, so first up, the supernatural thesis. What is the foundational claim actually being made here? Let's get right into the central idea that this entire argument is built on.
So the whole thing kicks off with this really bold idea that there's a huge, coordinated disinformation campaign going on. The core argument is that the constant denial of a spiritual or supernatural world isn't an accident, it's a deliberate strategy. And think about what that means for a second. If that's true, then the biggest lie in the world isn't about politics or money, it's about the very nature of reality itself.
All right, so let's get into the first piece of evidence that's offered up to support this whole idea. The source introduces a concept it calls the anti-human impulse.
So, what is this anti-human impulse? Well, it's defined as any major movement that seems, fundamentally self-destructive for us as a species. The argument is that you can actually see this impulse at play in a bunch of modern trends, and it frames them not just as human mistakes, but as proof of some outside influence that's basically working against our survival.
And to make this idea really concrete, the argument points to these specific examples: the push for nuclear war, the runaway development of AI, transhumanism. These are all presented as movements that are, kind of by definition, against humanity's best interests. And the key takeaway here is that these aren't just separate threats. They're seen as different symptoms of the same underlying anti-human force.
Now, what's so fascinating here is the contrast that's being drawn. The argument is that if you look at the entire animal kingdom, no other species intentionally works against its own survival. That kind of behavior, it's unique to us. So the logical leap being made is that this self-destructive urge, well, it can't be natural. And if it's not natural, the argument goes, it must come from an unnatural or supernatural source.
Okay, let's move on to the next major pillar of this argument. This part looks back at history and world religions to suggest that, hey, these ideas aren't new at all, they're actually ancient and everywhere. The implication is that maybe our modern scientific worldview is actually the weird one, the historical exception, and that we've forgotten a truth that everybody used to know. And a really central idea here is that the belief in tangible, physical, supernatural beings isn't some fringe idea. The source really stresses that in these old traditions, these beings weren't just spirits. They were seen as real physical things, as solid as the chair you're sitting in. This isn't being presented as a metaphor. It's being presented as a kind of lost, literal history.
You see, this isn't being presented as just one isolated myth, but as a universal story you find pretty much everywhere, all throughout human history. The fact that this belief is so consistent across cultures that we're totally separate is presented as a huge piece of evidence. The idea is that this consistency doesn't point to a shared delusion, but maybe to a shared ancient experience with something real.
So the argument brings up a whole bunch of different cultures, from Genesis 6 in the Bible and Hinduism to the Greek myths and the animist traditions of American Indians. The logic here is pretty straightforward. If all these completely separate groups came to the same kind of wild conclusion all by themselves, well, maybe we should stop treating them like stories and start treating them like corroborating witness statements.
Okay, so if this supernatural stuff is presented as a real historical thing, then how on earth has it been kept under wraps in our modern world? This next section gets into the alleged mechanism for how: a massive, coordinated disinformation campaign.
So, the starting point is something we now know is true. The government has been lying about UFOs for decades. But the argument here is that we might be completely missing the point of why they were lying. The implication isn't just that they hid the truth, but that they intentionally made us focus on alien technology to hide something way, way bigger.
And that leads to this absolutely critical question that's posed in the source material. What's the real motive behind this decades-long, systematic effort? If it's not really about protecting secrets about advanced alien craft, then what is the real secret they've been protecting all this time? And here's the answer that's put forward. The argument is that the cover-up was never about nuts and bolts technology. The real goal, it claims, has always been to enforce a purely materialistic worldview, to make us believe that the physical world is all there is. The implication is that this was done to basically spiritually disarm us, to make us unable to even recognize, let alone fight back against, the very forces that were being hidden.
So how do you see through all this? Well, the source actually proposes a method, kind of like a playbook for reverse engineering the lie. First, you have to recognize that you're being lied to. Second, you ask yourself why so much time and energy is being spent to push this one specific lie. And third, you conclude that the truth is probably the exact opposite of what you're being told. It's basically a tool for trying to find true north in a world designed to get you lost.
All right, this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, which is all about who actually gets it. The argument wraps up by identifying one specific group that it claims is uniquely ready to understand this hidden reality.
The argument lands on this really specific conclusion that the people who are best prepared to understand what's really happening are, quote, Bible readers. The idea is that for generations, these people were told their worldview was superstitious and silly, but it's precisely that framework, one that accepts the reality of a spiritual world, that makes them able to see what's actually going on. In this view, modern secularism isn't a lens, it's a blindfold.
And so that leaves us with this final, really provocative question that gets to the absolute heart of this whole thing. The entire argument is built on this idea of inversion, that the most important truths are the exact opposite of what the establishment tells us. And it really makes you ask, if that were true, how would you even begin to see it? What tools would you use to find your bearings? And how could you ever be sure you are uncovering a profound hidden truth and not just falling for a grand illusion?